So our next topic is going to be the device management tab. So the device management tab, as I mentioned before, is really the repository for all of the health and status for every media player / location in your facility. It's also how you can get information related to the currently running content of that player. It's where you can get into the configuration of that player and really dig into how it's set up, how it's behaving. It's also where you can send and control those players. So this is a tab that can be used to do things like sending channel changes to individual TVs. It can be used to power on and off individual TVs. So let's start by taking a look at our demo TV. So at the top right, you'll find that there is a search bar. There are 4 fields available to search on. Location is typically a plain English name, but the description is often a serial number. Again, in both of your facilities, there are 4-digit codes assigned to all of your DMPs that are searchable. But the location, in this case, is just demo. You can search on the IP address and the MAC address. Really, whatever helps you to hone in on the media player that you're looking for as quickly as possible, that's the field to search on. This should pull us up a single DMP. And so we'll see when we search initially, this is just the view that you're presented with. It provides you the location name, the model number, the IP address, the MAC address, the current firmware version, the TV power status, TV health status, and then an overall indication of the DMP's health. The information that you see is part of an autopoller that runs once every 2 minutes. So you might actually have stale information when you look at this initially. The easiest way to fix that is to go to this quick refresh device. Typically you have to push it twice, once to get it to poll and a second time for it to update on the GUI. You can also do this for a large number of DMPs simultaneously. This refresh button at the top essentially sends the same command. All of these utilize the top command in this menu, get status. The get status command initiates the poller on a DMP. That same command that goes out every 2 minutes automatically, you can also initiate manually by selecting a DMP, selecting get status, hitting play, and hitting OK. So that's basically 4 ways to get this information. 1 is fully automated, 3 are manual. The quickest way to do it really is through that refresh device. Now, when you've actually selected a DMP, there is a ton of configuration information that you can actually look at for the DMP. Almost every device in your environment is going to be identical. So really, oftentimes, from a troubleshooting perspective, the best thing to look for is something that isn't the same. You're doing a stare and compare to figure out what would be different. The first piece that I'm going to draw your attention to is this tab on the bottom called Compliance. Compliance are the specific DMP values that are configured in the Device Configuration tab that are pertinent to your environment. So we'll talk through all these real quick. DWS stands for the Diagnostic Web Server. It is the ability for you to go and browse to the IP address of a DMP to get status information on that DMP directly. By default in these systems, this is actually disabled. In both the Raiders and the SoFi environment, this is actually enabled. It's been turned on. You can confirm that the value on the device matches the required value, and that tells you that this device for sure is enabled for the Diagnostic Web Server. The rest of it's fairly straightforward. Has it gotten a DHCP address? Is it enabled to pull DHCP? Is it getting information from its time server? The NTP host should be correct for your environment, sync interval, time zone, VLAN, and firmware version. Those are really the key pieces. If all of those things match value on device to the required value, the DMP is almost certainly configured correctly. If any of these don't match, typically it would indicate either a fault on the DMP or a DMP that's been offline for some amount of time and the information is no longer correct for your current environment. The status tab will give you some of the same information, right? It's the same pieces as the compliance, but a ton of other individual configuration values. A lot of this isn't going to really be pertinent to most of day-to-day operations. But a couple of things here are actually really useful. Typically under MIB variables, you can very quickly identify the channel that a device is tuned to by searching for the term video. And you'll see that the URL, the media URL for that device, is identified here. You can also identify the video mode. That's the auto-negotiated output rate between the DMP and the television. So if it's connected to a 4K TV and it's auto-negotiating 3840 by 2160, you'd see that there. If you have a device that's supposed to be negotiated down to 1080, you would expect to see 1920 by 1080 by 60 here. There are also details related to the switch configuration that can be identified by searching for MSI. MSI just indicates that it's switch configuration data for that DMP. And under that MIB value, you can identify that the switch's IP address is as follows. That's typically the router for the VLAN segment and the switch port that device is connected to. That can be very useful for troubleshooting and identifying problems related to a DMP. That's most of what's usually valuable about the MIB value configuration. All of these are required to be set correctly for the device to perform the way you expect it to, but very few of these are modified from the default system values. Utilization can be worthwhile. If you suspect that there's a DMP that has an issue with its processor or memory, you'd be able to identify some of those problems based on the utilization tab, particularly seeing abnormal CPU utilization or memory utilization. There's also the possibility that a DMP would run out of disk space. That could happen if you have a lot of content that's been staged to a DMP over a period of time. This would be a great place to identify it. As a note, the behavior that you'd expect to see in a DMP there would be a region that you've set up in a template shows up as black. It would mean typically that the device has failed to receive its content correctly. And if you notice that it didn't have the appropriate amount of free disk space to receive that content, that would be one possible reason why. Again, settings gives you another way of just identifying some of this data in the same way. Basic, that's switch information, firmware information, port information. Display attributes, is it enabled to auto-detect its display? That's a device that doesn't have a display spec actively signed. Some additional network configuration information just to confirm that the device is getting what it's supposed to. Is its gateway correct for the VLAN segment that it's actually on? Does it have the appropriate net mask? Does it have the correct DNS server? This one actually is pertinent to the Raiders configuration. I know we had an issue fairly early on where you had the Coaches app and it wasn't resolving correctly because the DNS configuration for the DMPs was not correct. But that's a good place to check if you have issues with external web content. And then NTP, is it getting timing source information? So there's a lot of stuff that you can see about what's configured on the DMP from this informational page. The other thing that's really, really useful is the console tab. The console tab will give you timestamp messages that give you the feedback of every action that's been performed against that DMP. The ping from Cisco Vision, the get status request. If you send a channel change command, you'll be able to see not only what the channel change command was, but whether or not the DMP replied successfully. All of this is really, really useful stuff when you're trying to troubleshoot a DMP that is behaving poorly. So any questions about the detailed information related to a DMP that's shown in the device management tab?
I'm assuming if you need to adjust any of this, it's done through devices, right?
You actually do it through configuration. Yeah. Most of the stuff that you're seeing here, this is not like display spec information. This is the DMP itself, its configuration, all of which is really defined either as system defaults that we'll get into the configuration tab probably tomorrow, or is defined based on, it's really 100% of that's just what's in the configuration. Yeah. Other questions?
How does disk space fill up?
So almost all content that's set in this system is actually pushed out locally to the DMPs. So if you have a playlist of 1.5 gig video files, right? Let's say that you you've got to run down over the course of the day where you want to run like 24K 10-minute segments at 1.5 gigs apiece. Basically, every time a DMP is in a group or a zone that has a script, that has a playlist, that has content, and you stage that content, it actually gets pushed locally to the DMP. That's as opposed to like multicast video. This is being consumed in real time, does not take up disk space. But the little AmpThink bug that's down here, that's a local file that's playing back on the DMP. Typically, the only reason it would fill up would be a lot of content changes, deep playlists with a lot of items on them, a lot of video content. Those are the only reasons that you'd ever expect to. And there is a garbage collection cycle that runs on the DMPs. Basically, every morning at, I think, 4:30, there's a garbage collection process that kicks off. It identifies whether or not there's content staged on the DMP that doesn't exist in the content library for Cisco Vision, and it will delete that. But if you're not keeping regular tabs on your content library, that garbage collection never happens. So hypothetically, you could have a buildup of a lot of still content that the DMP can't safely remove during that garbage collection activity. So at the end of the day, the way to avoid that happening is just keep an eye on your content library, delete stuff that's not actively in use, old scripts that are unlikely to run again, delete them. That's just best practices stuff. Okay, so a couple of other things that are really useful here. So there is the ability to export a punch list directly from here. So if you have a set of DMPs that are offline, you want to just give yourself a quick CSV file of here are the things that we know are currently not functional. You could just do a quick search, identify via your filter that the DMP's health is critical, and then when you search, export this to a file. And that will generate a text-based CSV file that can be used as the foundation of a punch process. So this is a really great way to say, okay, we have these locations, like a good example, like taking a look here. These test kiosks, those 100% are not currently in service, but the level 1 radio dispatch DMP probably should be. So this says, we know that the DMP was online at least when it got its last firmware update. So when we moved to 6.3, it was previously online, but not right now. So you'd pull the information out of that CSV, identify where your action items are from an IT perspective, assign those out to tickets for the techs who are going to handle the actual requests, and it's just a good way of getting into a regular cadence of identifying issues that exist in infrastructure and resolving them. And as a matter of fact, we're just going to quickly open that file so that you can see a reference point for what it looks like. I'm using Excel, but really any spreadsheet management tool will work just fine. OpenOffice if you don't have a license for anything. So when you import a CSV file from a text file, you'll be given an option to choose the delimiter. In this case, comma. The moment you select comma, you'll immediately see that the information gets divided up the way you expect it to. That'll open up a spreadsheet that contains most of the same information that you were just looking at, plus some additional details. For example, the model of the TV. But mostly it's the device name, the IP address, and the MAC address. That's most of what you're looking for typically. So. Now you can also, if you needed more information, you could run an export from the device's configuration manager and then correlate the two together if you just need to pull more information out of it. But this is at least the easiest and quickest way to identify and export punch list of issues.
So status of critical can mean a number of things. What are the most common issues that you receive?
99% of the time, it's that the device is not online. It's either a physical network issue or a configuration issue. The only situation where you would typically see a critical DMP when that DMP was responding could be if a DMP had managed to come online prior to a major configuration change and had avoided a reboot, either because the reboot command never reached the device and it's just hung on the network with a stale configuration for a long time, or like a device that that was on like a network cable that was passing power but not data, and the device never rebooted for the same reason. But 99% of the time, your issue is going to be port configuration is wrong, or there's a problem in the path going from the DMP out to the switch.
If a DMP is potentially overheating, let's say site signage, it's out there, it's been in the sun, would that support critical, or would that, how would it indicate that it's overheating?
There is no indication whatsoever. The DMPs do not have any kind of temperature measurement internally. You would see that it would stop communicating, basically. What you're looking for is, remember before, if I pick a particular DMP, well, let's go to a site signage DMP, just for a reference point. Let's see, T4. So if we take a look at status under utilization, right, we want to see, if you look at CPU load, that's a really good indicator, because CPU load is going to absolutely spike if you've got major heating problems. These are completely normal values. If we click through, some are going to be higher than others, right? But yeah, 0.4. This is high-ish, but not enough for it to really be considered critical. But it's.
What value would you say it's critical?
Oh, if you're hitting above 1, it's a problem. Yeah. But you really want to see these, you know, and like the running multicast video is typically the thing that is the most taxing for any of these devices. If you're running high motion multicast content, anywhere between like 0.07 and like 0.3, very typical. A little higher than that sometimes, depending on, especially if it's in a high temperature environment. But you know, if it's getting much higher than that, then it would typically be a problem. But again, that status connection, 100% expectation is that if you see it go red, it's almost certainly offline. So overall, any questions about DMP information, what's presented on this informational tab? Any questions about searching?
TV health being critical, that's kind of irrelevant, right?
It's in this case, it's meaningless. Basically, the DMP has the ability, if there's a return channel off of the TV, to confirm the status of the TV over RS-232 or HDMI CEC. If we were using HDMI CEC to control these TVs, that would probably clear out all of these. I'll give you a really good example. If we do a search for the demo, I have this TV configured for HDMI CEC, which contains a return channel that gives us status on the TV. And you'll note that we've got TV power on, TV health normal. The Samsung RS-232 protocol doesn't include a return channel information that's meaningful. So if we're using RS-232 control, we're going to get back TV health of critical, because it's just getting no information, right?
And TV power as well.
Yeah. What it will have is the last command that you've sent manually from the dashboard.
Right.
It's not really going to give you a real idea of whether the TV is on or off.
Or no,
Yeah.
physical power.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's why this TV is displaying.
Yeah, it's because it's using HDMI CEC, so instead of using RS-232 to send and receive, it's using the HDMI cable, and that's, yeah.
Why did you go serial throughout the stadium?
You can do a lot more. You have more control over the edge device. So two things. The first thing is HDMI CEC requires that to send a command, it has to be the active input on the TV. So if for some reason the device moves from being the correct input to the wrong input, and you send a global power on command, the device is going to behave like there's nothing connected to it, which is a challenge. The other piece is that a bunch of the commands that you can run over RS-232 are not supported by the HDMI CEC standard. So for example, setting input. You can't change the input on a TV that's using HDMI CEC control. You can't really control volume. You don't have the ability to control mute state. You can do a lot more with RS-232. What you lose, specifically because of the vendor, other TVs, LG is a good example, do support a return channel on RS-232. Sony reports a return channel on RS-232. Samsung does not. It's, you know, yeah. So there are positives and negatives to the way that it's set up. You basically have more control but less information, right? It's always a trade-off.
You're sending, but you're not receiving.
Correct. Yeah. And then the other piece too, as a note, there is this command status tab. For whatever reason, Cisco adds these commands to the bottom of the list. This resets every time the server is reset. So just as a part of general operations, do a restart on the services or on the server every couple of weeks, and that'll really help, you know, make sure that this doesn't become a massive backlog. A couple of notes about searching for devices in this tab. Every time you do a search, it automatically clears out the previous search. So if I search for, you know, I'll go back to Sinai, you'll see that the previous search was removed. Now, you can actually pin these devices to the search using this convenient push pin. While that's selected, any term that you search for will add to this list as opposed to replace it. So if I now search for demo, this will move from 30 to 31. 31 selected. And then you can select any individual set of media players out of your search results. Any command that you're going to issue will be applied to whatever has been selected on the left side. If you pick the top, it automatically selects everything in your search range. So you'll just get everything returned back.
And your search results will continue to stack as long as that pin is in there.
Correct. And if I click it again, it will clear the results, like that. And until I hit the pin, it will not pin any results. So now I'm just going to use my demo here for an example so that we can start sending out some DMP commands. So every command that you can send against a media player exists in this drop-down menu above your search selection. We're going to go through each one of these one at a time and identify what each of them do and what you would use them for. So get status we've already talked about. This is a DMP health poller. It basically checks that the DMP is reachable from the Cisco Vision server and that from the perspective of the server, everything on the DMP is configured correctly. It's basically the check to say, should this light be green or should this light be red? That runs automatically every 2 minutes, but you can always refresh it manually if you're rebooting a player or you're deploying a new device. There are a bunch of good reasons to run that check manually, but it will automatically check every 2 minutes. It is also worth noting, and this is sort of an API third-party control integration piece. Because that health poller only runs every 2 minutes, when you run a status check from a third-party API call, you could be getting data that's as much as like 1.5 minutes, almost 2 minutes old. It is not a real-time status update. So sending in an API call saying, what's the current channel, is not necessarily an indication of what the actual current channel is. Just a really important caveat, because that's come up both here in the stadium, it's come up in the PV. I don't think it's necessarily come up at HQ, but you do have, you know, some third-party Crestron control that does talk about some of this. So if you're ever in a position where you're having a conversation with the Crestron integrators, you at least have that information that you can refer back to. So ping, you will never use. It is not really useful inside of Cisco Vision to be able to ping a DMP. I mean, typically, if you find yourself in a position where you have to identify if there's a network response off of a DMP, you'll be doing it just by opening a command line. You know, you open like terminal on a Mac or whatever, and you try and ping the device. It's a much more useful tool. Display IP will show the IP address of the device that you're looking at. It's really helpful if you're not totally sure that the DMP that you're in front of is the one that you're really looking for. You can also specify for that to remain on the screen longer. Duration in seconds. 5 is the default. You can send it for as long as you would like to, and it will stay up for the duration that you specify. Restart runtime. This command will rejoin the DMP to the script state that's currently running. So if for some reason a device is not currently running the appropriate content, a good way to confirm that it's at least doing what the system is telling it to, you restart the runtime, see if it rejoins the script correctly. This will also do things like if you were to run suite content. I think we talked about this as a suite content methodology, but if you have a big script where there's custom content and then the user turns away from that content, restart runtime will restore it back to the content that's supposed to be running. Enable and disable the diagnostic web server. So we talked before about the fact that you can browse directly to a DMP to see some of its status, look at its logs, check its configuration. It is enabled in all of your systems, but again, Cisco Vision 6.3 does disable it by default. So if for some reason you find that you have a player where it's disabled and you want to enable it again, you can simply send the enable command. The device will reboot, and when it reboots, you'll be able to browse to it via its IP address. The password for this diagnostic web server is found in your system configuration. And I'm going to show you quickly where that's located, but we'll circle back to this again later. In system configuration, under advanced registry settings, you'll find the default DMP admin password. And you can use that.
That changes every, what, 24 hours?
It does. So you can manually set that to a fixed value if you choose to, but you know, typically good to leave it as the default. So we'll also go back here, and I'll show you what that looks like real quick. So when you browse the DMP, it'll prompt you for a username and password. Default username is admin. You've identified where the password's located. And this is what you'll be presented with, this bright sign informational screen. It'll show you some useful stuff. The video mode, for example, it's auto-negotiated, it's firmware version, MAC IP, serial number, DMP type. You can reboot a DMP from here via the control tab. You can force recovery, which basically says it's going to reboot and ask the server for its initial configuration again. And factory reset does exactly what you expect it to. When you factory reset a DMP, it literally goes back through its staging process from the beginning. That shouldn't really be common. More likely than not, if you were to use this for anything, it would be the reboot by itself. You can also check the hard disk status here. This will show you all of the files that have been uploaded to the DMP and the overall SSD usage. The log shows you a detailed list of every command that you could see come in and out of that DMP. Again, mostly useful for troubleshooting or for dealing with technical assistance requests. And then a couple of other things. You can ping from a DMP out to another IP address if you want to see if it has a one-directional communication. Even if you can't reach into that DMP, you can run a trace route. You can test if it can look up a web address, and this gets back to the DNS lookup for a web thing. You could put the URL the DMP is trying to reach right in here, and then use that to say, oh, okay, the DMP isn't actually resolving this hostname. And then you can run a network packet capture directly on the player. You can check its local network neighborhood. A bunch of very useful stuff here. And then video here, just a strong bit of caution. It does look like you can change the video mode to a different output. Do not do this. If you change the video mode here, it'll create a mismatch in Cisco Vision, and the device will no longer become responsive until you factory reboot it. So informational only, don't change this.
So you change the display spec where? If you don't do it there?
That's in the configuration for the location. And we'll get into that tomorrow when we get into the DMP configuration piece. So that gets us down as far as enable and disable diagnostic web server. Start and stop streaming. You can do the same thing you can with a script to start or stop the streaming from the HDMI input on a DMP. So if we hit start streaming, for example, this will ask us, do we want to do display or HDMI streaming? What multicast address do we want to send it to? How do we want to configure the output video mode? And a couple of other configurations related to the encoding of that video. These are all set in your defined channel presets if you're running it through a script. If you're doing it manually here, you just have to set it yourself. You can also stop streaming here as well. You can start and stop a web application. Again, the same way you can from a script. You can just do it to a specific DMP. You just specify the URL. So for example, and now our TV is showing us Google. And again, the same note applies for starting and stopping a web application on a DMP directly as it would in a script. You just have to make sure that you stop it when you're finished. Because otherwise, Google will just play on that TV forever. And as you'll note, it'll go back to the state that it was running in if it's running a script, or it'll go back to its default multicast. Send RS-232 does basically the same thing that the script state does. The difference is you do have to specify the hex command that you actually want to send directly. So if you wanted to use an RS-232 function available on a particular TV that's not defined in this display spec, you could 100% send it here directly. As long as you know the command and it's a valid command for the TV type that you're connected to, you can send it. And this applies even if you have a display spec setup that doesn't use RS-232. So like for example, on this TV, we have HDMI CEC configured. There's no RS-232 wiring connected to the TV, but if it was, we could just send a hex command out that port and still control that TV. Reboot device. No further explanation required. It is also worth noting that this does tell the director server to reboot the device. It's not talking to the switch to do any power cycling. If director can't reach the DMP because it just can't over the network, the device will not reboot. So it's worth noting that if your DMP's health is red, rebooting it from here is probably not going to do you much good. Restore default settings, you're really never going to use. When a DMP boots, it really gets its configuration correctly. So it's smarter to just reboot the player than to try and push the restore default settings command. But you can. Reset storage clears out everything in the storage cache. This is a good way if for some reason you do get a DMP that's absolutely backed up. This will clear it out for sure. TV on and off, do exactly what they look like. Again, the on and off commands rely on the display spec assigned to a location to send that power on and off command. So if the display spec is incorrect for the TV you're connected to, that command's not going to do any good. But as long as the configuration is correct for the location, the commands will power the TV on and off. Same thing applies for the set display input, although in this case, you actually put in the string that's defined for the input name. So this would require you checking the display spec for the TV and confirming, is there an HDMI 1? If so, you would hit OK. And it would match that HDMI 1 to the input name and then use the associated RS-232 string to change the input. Set display banner just shows that banner. Setting closed captioning enables or disables closed captioning. So if we hit here, we can show the mode to CC1. There's no closed captioning currently enabled, but you can see from the top banner, it shows you what the current mode is. Typically CC1 and CC2 are likely all that you're going to carry if you're embedding any kind of closed captioning at all. CC1 for almost all of the DirecTV stuff. And then if you're trying to disable it, that string should be off, which does exactly what you see. Set volume, this typically only allows you to modify the volume on the DMPs. Because your volume strategy is external, which is that you're sending RS-232 commands to raise the volume up and down, this won't really do anything for you. The only places where this would have an impact would be in your rack DMPs. Although typically you don't want to touch these because the input volume from the DMP is usually set specifically for the amp stack. So if you modify the DMP's volume, you can throw off what the DSPs are doing in the BSS system. So I would typically not touch this very much. It's like a command of last resort. Set video channel can get used a ton. You pick your specific DMP, you hit the play button, you identify the channel that you want to go to, you select that channel, and you tune that channel. You can also enter in the multicast address directly by changing to URL, but it's very convenient to just do it from here.
Indeed.
Finally, so show and hide diagnostics. This is very useful to put up a screen that can be used to identify individual displays. It gives you a lot of useful information, whether the device is registered, which again, if you can send this command to a DMP, I would expect it will always show a Y. The IP address, which is very useful for you identifying whether or not a device is an appropriate IP address for the right network segment. The MAC address, the serial number, firmware, and a variety of other really useful information. The fact that it shows you the switch port information is actually really, really nice. You could hit an entire like network segment worth of devices and just say, okay, what's this specific one on from a port perspective, and just use it. Display pin. This will actually show us a pin number because there is a pin assigned for it. And actually, the diagnostics are conflicting, so I'm going to take the diagnostics off. But the show pin shows you the pin that's required to get into the local control. So if you were using the Cisco Vision Plus dashboard and giving it out to a suite holder, for example, I know that from the SoFi perspective, there's a plan to try and isolate those control planes a little bit more than what you've currently got. But if you do happen to have access to Cisco Vision Plus in a dashboard, you know, like for coaches, for example, you could give them a Cisco Vision Plus dashboard, put the pin up on the screen, and just say, you can control it. Say you can, but you don't have to. So we can also show and hide the channel guide. And then these last two, the change DMP state and provision DMP, really don't apply at all to the current state of Cisco Vision. They're holdovers from an older media player model that doesn't really apply to. So that's all of the commands in Device Manager that you can use to interact with DMPs. Any question about any of those?
Can you talk about the volume on the cost? If raising the volume on the DMP, how that affects the London, the BSS?
Are you familiar with the concept of gain staging?
No.
So the whole idea is, if you increase the volume of something that's going into a device that's increasing the volume of that thing, at the other side, eventually it's going to distort, right? Okay. So the main thing is your AV folks, the ProMedia guys, have dialed in the gain for the system based on an expected input volume. So if you increase it, you're just changing the environment. You know, you're welcome to push it. It's your system. You can do whatever you want. But my general recommendation tends to be, it's been dialed in. Should typically leave, unless something is really not working the way you expect it to. That wouldn't be the place that I would start changing. I would look at the BSS system before I looked at the DMP volume.
So DMP volume, obviously we want to stay at 50, but how do we change the physical TV volume? Let's say someone calls me and says, my TV's blaring.
RS-232.
Where is that command?
That send RS-232, and you would have to pull the volume command out of the display spec.
Oh, right.
Right. I'll show you very quickly, right? But we will get more into that a little bit later. But for the TV type, if we look at display specifications, you know, we'll go to Samsung display parameters. These are the actual RS-232 hex codes that do that work, right? So you'd move to volume up or volume down or to mute, and you'd pull this portion of the code out of the display spec. You would send RS-232, you would add right there. Yep, that's just the only thing that you can do.
So you have to do it model by model.
Yes, or you would use Crestron Fusion, right, and use a Crestron command to tell the DMP to send it up and down.
And also backed by a Crestron.
Correct. Yep.
Got it.
Other questions? So the only other thing that I want to show you guys is you can actually get a preview of what's playing on a DMP directly off of this system as well. So if a DMP is in a group in a zone, you can select that individual DMP, move from this detailed view to a thumbnail view, and this is a live thumbnail of the content playing on the DMP. If you hit refresh, it'll repoll it and identify what's currently playing. So if you've got a script state going that's playing like an overlay with the transparency, this will show you what this should look like on the TV. It's what the DMP, I'll frequently use the terms, this is what the DMP thinks it's playing. It doesn't tell you what the TV is showing, and it's a really important differentiation to make. It tells you what the DMP is trying to send to the TV. It's a good first step in troubleshooting whether or not content is correct. Now, from here, if you've selected an individual DMP, you can also use this very simple little channel change application to do things like send out a channel change command. You can also send power on and off commands from here, provided that RS-232 is configured. And you can also do a refresh or a reboot. So if we wanted to reboot this DMP, we could do it from here. There's also some additional configuration information that you can grab. Again, the video mode and the screen resolution. Less detailed than the detail view, but that's available for you here as part of this whole rundown. So, any questions about any of that?
I think a more general question. So I don't know if you've already covered all the API stuff, but basically...
We have not at all. That's tomorrow.
I think talk tomorrow. You just talk through there. Would that be available within the API as well?
Not everything. So the API have very specific and limited sets of things that they can actually control. Things like sending RS-232 commands for like volume, for sure. Volume, mute, power, channel changes, general status, all of that can be controlled via API, but not much else.
Yeah, I was familiar with those and thought I saw some other things with advanced and I was curious to do it, so yeah.
Yeah. And that's pretty much it. All right, and I think we've gotten through the full planned curriculum for today. So congratulations, you've made it through the first gauntlet. Tomorrow is drier, I'm so sorry.